English translation 214th contact. Tuesday, 3rd February 1987, 14:39 hours.
Be also greeted, my friend. And be welcome. May I ask you, at the outset of our conversation, to answer some questions?
Certainly. But later, I would like to discuss with you some concerns that are of a purely private nature.
Of course. Well then. Since you concern yourself, among many other things, also with biblical, respectively, Hebrew history, and since you call rather large areas of knowledge your own in this respect, you can surely tell me what the Exodus from Egypt, in reference to the duration of the crossing of the desert, is all about. In the Bible, it is claimed that the great Exodus wandering lasted for 40 years, until the entrance into the so-called Promised Land took place.
This assertion of the Bible does not correspond on more truth because the time of the entire Exodus, up to the invasion and occupation of the Promised Land, only lasted for 40 weeks.
So 40 is true, but these were not years but rather only weeks. At the same time, when I consider the distance from Egypt to Palestine, then the reality hits even sooner, because where would the Hebrews have wandered around in the desert for 40 years, and on what would they have lived and satisfied their thirst? Moreover, the Mediterranean Sea was always on the left side from Egypt to Palestine, by which the refugees could orient themselves, and along which they also moved, alternating in the nearer distance, and then again in the further distance. Now, also regarding the death of Moses, statements are made that are not correct, as Sim Yaseh once explained to me. What is the truth concerning this?
Moses was murdered by Joshua and his accomplices. The reason for this was rather manifold. On the one hand, Joshua wanted to gain control over the Hebrews, which is why he later claimed that in this respect, Moses had determined this through God's command, for it was even God's will. And on the other hand, Moses became hated by many, as well as by the murderous accomplices, not in the least because of the fratricides of the unbelievers of God and of Moses, which were mercilessly committed against all those who were not of Moses' view, and who did not believe his words, and who contributed to strife through this.
So that was it. Well then, on my great journey, it was shown to me by Ptah, at a little more than 50 million light-years away from the SOL system, a galaxy, in whose center an enormously gigantic explosion allowed everything to shake. I have told an engineer, Rise, about this, but I no longer remember the name of the galaxy.
Sim Yaseh told me about that. The name of the galaxy? We call it Globalung. Also on Earth, it will become well known among the humans, but only around the turn of the millennium, whereby it will already be well known to astronomers prior to this. Their designation for it will be NGC 4636.
Aha. To view this galaxy was, for me, something especially remarkable. Yet since we are already at it, if I remember correctly, Ptah also explained to me that comet tails carry toxic substances with themselves, which are also essential ingredients for the formation of dwarf suns, from which larger stars can then develop.
That is of correctness. The main toxic substance of this kind is hydrocyanic acid.
Hydrocyanic acid, yes, I remember. Ptah said hydrocyanic acid. This is indeed highly toxic to humans. Depending on the amount of hydrocyanic acid consumed, severe cramps, vomiting, shortness of breath, and then unconsciousness and death set in, namely as a result of respiratory paralysis. First aid can, in fact, only be rendered via fresh air resuscitation, and to be sure, only by a device, respectively by a suitable apparatus. Under no circumstances may mouth-to-mouth resuscitation be performed because through this, the helping person poisons him or herself through the rescue breathing, and can even die, just because they, through the mouth-to-mouth breathing, inhale the poisonous breath of the poisoned person.
That is of correctness. A poisoning by hydrocyanic acid or its salts, particularly potassium cyanide, through the gastrointestinal tract, through the lungs or the skin, causes a blockage of the inner cell respiration. With the iron atom of the respiratory enzymes, an iron cyanide complex is formed, which impairs the oxygen combining capacity and the oxygen intake into the cells so severely that these functions fail and expire completely.
You are, among other things, also a doctor and must know this exactly.
That is of correctness.
I am still in outer space with my questions, and this time with the asteroid Eros, which I was allowed to view on the Great Journey and which looks like a potato, littered with thousands of large boulders and covered in many places by blue dust or other blue material, whereby also many craters cover the surface of the space projectile. The largest crater, as Ptah said, is about 7,500 meters wide, if I remember correctly. In addition, now the question that one asked me, over and over again, it is to be read that this asteroid could collide with the Earth one day, which would mean a global catastrophe and the end of all life on the Earth, since Eros still has a size of about 35 kilometers. What should be thought of this also with regard to other asteroids that also often come into the vicinity of the Earth? Is the anxiety justified concerning such a catastrophe?
In relation to the asteroid Eros, not in any wise, unless Sol system-based upheavals would occur, through which a change could be brought about, as this would also be possible through influences that are foreign to the Sol system, such as by large comets or wandering planets like the Destroyer, by which the asteroid could be thrown from its orbit and be directed towards the Earth, but this is extremely unlikely. The possibility that Eros could fall to the Earth in the foreseeable future is less than 3%. But on the other hand, there is a continuously ongoing possibility that impacts can occur on the Earth by other asteroids. But these do not exhibit such enormous proportions as Eros, yet they could still cause enormous catastrophes. However, these asteroids are small in size, namely from a few meters to a few kilometers. During the period leading up to the turn of the millennium, a number of such objects will arrive in the near vicinity of the Earth, but without endangering the Earth directly, even if, at the same time, the distance mark of such an asteroid falls below the 200,000-kilometer mark from the Earth, and thus the object passes closer to the Earth than the Moon. Also, at the end of the first and at the beginning of the second year of the new millennium, an asteroid the size of a few hundred meters, which will still be unknown to the earthly scientists until then, will cross Earth's orbit at a distance of a little more than 500,000 kilometers away, as this will also be the case several times with a small number of other asteroids until then. With a few exceptions, all of these objects will be discovered by the terrestrial scientists and amateur astronomers when the point in time of the approach to the Earth comes. This also applies in relation to comets, which are newly discovered and which sometimes exhibit orbital periods that are thousands of years long, for they travel far beyond the Oort cloud in their orbits.
Well, then to purely earthly problems, if I may say so. Actually, it is a problem that the earthly fortune-tellers, astrologers, and clairvoyants, etc., drive the human beings into anxiety and terror with their allegedly precise predictions. One of you once said that a clearly and rationally thinking person, if he or she considers, analysis and, therefore, evaluates all facts precisely, arrives at a prediction rate of about 14% reliability, respectively. Accuracy, while the percentages for the clairvoyants, fortune-tellers, and astrologers, and similarly stored, categorized nonsense bringers, are only at an accuracy rate of a maximum of 3 to 4%.
That is also of correctness. people who use their normal and healthy intellect to make a prediction of the future on the basis of existing situations and events, facts, etc., and, thus, on the basis of past and present situations of any kind, usually arrive at an average correctness value of about 14%. This, in contrast to all the flimsy, misleading, fanciful, senseless, and unrealistic projections and statements of clairvoyants, astrologers, and fortune-tellers, etc., whose success rates lie at a maximum of 3 to 4%.
Then at least 3 to 4% accuracy.
Unfortunately, no. For this is not something that is based on a recognition of the future, but solely on a stroke of fate, which is erroneously called chance by the Earth humans. Although there is no such thing in that sense, because chance is only given when, for example, something falls to a person, such as portion of a profit or, otherwise, a share of something. Only in this form can the term chance have its correctness, but not with respect to when something unexpected arises, which one was not counting on and, therefore, which arises from the joining together of the given and complementary and interlocking relationships, and thus becomes a stroke of fate.
You explained that well. In truth, things, situations, and events, as well as occurrences, etc., simply fit themselves together and join into one another in such a manner that a particular effect emerges from this, freely according to the law of causality, that is, the law of cause and effect. This will result in certain effects that, in turn, arise from specific causes, as I just explained. So strokes of fate are nothing other than occurrences, events, incidents, and situations, etc., that result from a certain joining together in order to act as specific causes. So, for example, if it happens that two people meet unexpectedly somewhere in a foreign country, then it cannot and should not be designated as chance, but rather solely as a stroke of fate. For the causes of this are given that both people traveled to the same country and are staying at the same place, where they will then meet. So the one joins itself to the other and the one to another, from which then emerges the result, respectively the effect, even the stroke of fate.
Another time, I must say that this is also of correctness.
Nice. Good then. Here. I have another question from an 11-year-old boy who occupies himself with ornithology and thus with the study of birds. He asked me about how the birds know what they can eat. With this, he means what is edible for them and what is inedible, respectively toxic, for them, or how the birds know, in particular, what berries to eat, whether the fruits would be ripe and good for them.
That is no secret. Mature fruits and berries store and reflect solar radiation, and when these are ripe, they emit light in the ultraviolet range, even when the sun is not shining. This shortwave light is perceived by the birds, as well as by certain animals and insects, and it is the signal that the fruits or berries are ripe for digestion. This equally applies to the edibility of fruits and berries. Grasses and leaves, etc., which emit a certain radiation that is perceived by the organisms and that informs them that the food which is important for them is non-toxic.
Thank you for the explanation. The boy will be happy about it. With Simyase, I once observed an optical phenomenon in the Arctic, namely 3 suns, which came about by the fact that the real sun was reflected twice in the atmosphere, once to the left and once to the right of its actual location. What I want to ask is this: does this phenomenon appear every year?
That is of correctness, yes.
As a doctor and physician, etc., you can surely explain to me how fatigue arises, right?
I can do that. In the nerve cells, the resting substance, adenosine, is formed, through which listlessness and fatigue arise.
And can this actually be counteracted with coffee and tea,
The waking amine, caffeine of coffee and the theine of tea can actually counteract the adenosine. If substances such as caffeine or theine, etc., are fed to the body while it is lethargic, tired, and in need of recuperation, then these will produce a counter effect with respect to the adenosine, namely by suppressing or neutralizing this, whereby the maximum effect of the caffeine and theine or other similar waking amines will be achieved, but only about 1–2 hours after their consumption. But soon, the effect of the waking amines will diminish again, which means, for the body in need of recuperation and for its nerve cells which produce the adenosine, that now the resting substance must be increasingly produced by listlessness and fatigue become apparent in an intensified form.
Lately, the question arises again and again as to what circumstances cause the so-called infant death, whereby there are many speculations about this. Can you tell me a few things about this?
Because there are several reasons for this, it would not make sense to mention them all. However, it should be said that there is an erroneous view of the so-called infant death, which is also known as sudden infant death syndrome, aka SIDS, among the Earth humans. This erroneous view consists of the notion that small children, primarily infants, are supposed to be placed on their bellies in order to be put to sleep or after a meal. This crazy view is based on the wrong acceptance that there is a lower risk of choking if the child would suddenly vomit or simply cough up what has been eaten. But when infants are placed on their bellies, they are exposed to the risk that the heart and lungs, as well as the other vital organs, will become impaired in their functions as a result of the pressure on the belly, which can lead to sudden death and also to the fact that the exhaled carbon dioxide is inhaled again due to the infant lying on the belly, which can lead to a quick and deadly result. Another important point to be mentioned in relation to sudden infant death syndrome is found with the parents or parental guardians. And unfortunately, precisely this fact to be mentioned is unknown to the doctors and medical professionals and to the courts and supervisory bodies on Earth, which is extremely regrettable. The reason why there are so many sudden infant deaths to be mentioned in all countries of the world, although mainly in the so-called civilized countries or industrial nations, is because sudden infant death syndrome is induced consciously and also unconsciously by a parent, or even by both parents but also by parental substitutes, namely when these lose nervous control over themselves and uncontrollably maltreat the infants, shaking and abusing them to such an extent that deadly injuries to the brain arise, by which means sudden death occurs within minutes, hours, or a few days. Unfortunately, this fact will run rampant more and more, for the human beings, mainly those of the industrialized countries, who become increasingly indifferent, addicted to pleasure, unsteady, loveless, and dismissive among themselves and towards each other. But at the same time, they also strain their nerves as a result of this, which lets them get out of control very quickly, in order to commit thoughtless and uncontrolled actions as a further consequence, accompanied by fierce anger that can have deadly results, just like when young children are abused in the aforementioned manner, whereby sudden infant death is then the result. But unfortunately, research in this direction has not yet been performed by the Earth human, which is why no relevant findings will be made for quite some time, so also not with regard to other forms of maltreatment of small children by adults, by whom sudden infant death syndrome is induced.
That is horrible. How long will it take, then, until it has come so far that this form of sudden infant death syndrome is recognized, and the respective uncaring parents are called to account?
Unfortunately, on Earth, respectively with the Earth humans, True justice is still written in very small letters, for there is still too much negligence, and thus serious and very severe crimes are punished more mildly and more gently than small offenses. It often seems that the courts would have great respect for serious and very severe crimes and, therefore, would pass more lenient sentences for these than what seems to be the case with smaller crimes, for which no respect is given and which, thus, are condemned harshly. But to answer your question, I must say that it will still take a long time before the aforementioned criminal form of sudden infant death syndrome is recognized and punished. Before the start of the third millennium, this will not be the case. So in any case, it must be accepted.
So nothing else remains but to wait.
There is no other possibility.
So just stick to it. Then another question. Did Luke ever make a portrait of Emmanuel? To my knowledge, such is attributed to him.
That does not correspond to the truth. In no wise did Luke master the art of drawing. Consequently, he was also in no position to produce a portrait of Emmanuel. Such a portrait of Emmanuel, which is attributed to him, comes from an artist of Italian origin, who never saw Emmanuel and who also had no description with respect to Emmanuel's appearance. His name was Alfonso Stranieri.
Then I have a question in reference to Queen Nefertiti, who was the wife of Pharaoh Amenhotep IV, who was also known as Akhenaten, and who, to my knowledge, reigned in the 14th century BC, from 1364 to 1347. Where was Nefertiti actually buried? Her real name, so I think, was Nefertiti, right?
That is of correctness. Nevertheless, a tomb of Nefertiti does not exist, but rather only one of her double, who was the concubine of Amenhotep of Akhenaten, but this was kept secret, and thus also was not handed down in any records. The name of Nefertiti's double was Chepres, which meant the powerful one, while Nefertiti's name meant the beautiful one has come. Nefertiti and Chepres were neither twin sisters nor in any way connected to each other in kinship, yet they were hardly able to be distinguished by those who were initiated. Thus, both of them alternately appeared before the people, who remained unaware of the fact that these were two different women who, moreover, hated one another until death. In consequence of this, then, it came to the murder of Chepres, who was killed by Nefertiti with snake venom. Both were boundlessly jealous of each other, even though Amenhotep IV, respectively Akhenaten, treated both of them equally. After the murder, Nefertiti naturally feared the revenge and punishment of Akhenaten, so she disguised herself and fled from the palace undetected in order to board a ship with accomplices, which should have taken them to foreign lands. After several hours on the Mediterranean Sea, however, they were surprised by a heavy storm by which the small ship was shattered and sank, together with Nefertiti and the whole crew, into the wild waters. That was the actual end of Nefertiti. After the murder of Chepres, Akhenaten let her be secretly buried and took as his wife her twin sister, who resembled her to the hair, and this was the one who henceforth lived at the side of Amenhotep IV as Nefertiti and as an Egyptian queen, and who entered into history.
And the model bust made of painted limestone, which was found in Amarna during excavations, now represents the real Nefertiti.
In addition to the bust mentioned by you, several unfinished ones still exist. But all of them do not represent Nefertiti, but represent Chepres' identical twin sister Nephthi, as her name was.
Pretty obscure, this history. But it fits well with that time period. And since we are in Egypt, How is it that so many archaeologists and grave robbers met sudden deaths while excavating or robbing the ancient pharaohs' tombs, or else died within hours, days, or a few weeks?
There are several reasons for that, but the two most important ones are the following. To protect the tombs against grave robbery, one method was that spines, which were thinner than hair and which were of the fruit of the Indian cactus, were soaked with deadly poisons, were dried, and were then painted onto bandages with which the dead were wrapped. The deadly poisons of the kind that was used are extremely stable and are still effective even after thousands of years. Now, if grave robbers and archaeologists, etc., touched the bandages of the mummified bodies, then the poisonous spines penetrated into their hands without this being noticed, because the spines of the cactus figs are much thinner than a human hair. In addition, the insidious poison was of a different kind, so it was also different in the temporal effect, which could occur in either hours or days, or only after 2 or 3 weeks. Another very popular and lethal means was the use of fungal spores that were cultivated specifically for the purpose of the quick killing of the grave robbers. So the bandages of the deceased as well as the sarcophagi and the tomb walls, etc., were infected with these. Now when grave robbers, or later archaeologists, entered the tombs, as a result of their entering and also by the work taken up, they whirled up dust that was loaded with deadly fungal spores. The extremely toxic dust was inhaled by the grave robbers and archaeologists, and this quickly led to death, which came about very quickly, or over days, or over several weeks. These are the two main means by which the tombs and the treasures of the pharaohs were protected against grave robbers.
Interesting. What do you think about meddling in other people's cultures, respectively in their interests, etc.? By this, I mean not only interfering in foreign cultures of foreign planets and civilizations, but specifically that which is common on Earth, especially in connection with the religions, and I think especially of Christianity, which has sent its henchmen, representatives, priests, and missionaries to foreign nations since ages ago, to natives and to other faiths, in order to convert these to the Christian faith and to the civilization of the white man, either peacefully or very often by forceful proselytizing, by what means there have always been many deaths over and over again, when the foreign nations, natives, and those of other faiths did not follow the sense of the missionaries, etc., through the criminal doings and dealings. The old traditions and customs as well as the old beliefs of the natives were, and are still today, destroyed by these men of God, by the missionaries, who harassed them and who took from them their very own freedom and way of life.
Those are not only senseless machinations, but even criminal and felonious ones that should never appear. With us, such interventions and interferences are strictly illegal in every form, and thus are prohibited by appropriate directives. This equally applies to interventions and interferences in the private matters of each person, so also with respect to all matters of families, friends, acquaintances, and communities, etc.
I find that to be good and humane, but unfortunately, one cannot say this in reference to the actions of the religions and their missionaries. Criminal and felonious are actually the right labels for their irresponsible actions. But now, tell me what social status Simon Peter had, I mean the disciple of Emmanuel.
He was of the propertied class, and therefore very rich. It was he who constantly donated from his own wealth for the implementation of the mission and for the spreading of Emmanuel's teaching. If this would not have been so, then everyone would have had to live a more frugal life than what was, in fact, the case. While there were other wealthy ones among the disciples, who also contributed their part to everything, it was Simon Peter, however, who was the main donor.
And Matthew, the tax collector.
He was also quite wealthy.
Then another area. It is well known to me that salt is very important for humans, as it also naturally is for animals and plants. But now, what interests me is when in fact, the first large salt deposits formed on the Earth, and furthermore, how the balance of salt affects the person. You should at least be able to answer the last question as a physician.
That is of correctness. And since I also deal with geology, I can also answer the first question for you. The first large salt deposits on Earth formed around 340 million years ago, but the main ones first formed 240 to 270 million years ago. In relation to life forms, salt is very important. But if I should speak of humans alone, then the following is to be explained. Salt is an extremely important component of the blood. Normally, between 45 and 50 grams of sodium chloride flow through the veins of the person in a solution as sodium and chlorine ions. This concentration of salt must remain constant. If there is too little of it in the blood, then there arises an excess pressure in the red blood cells, making them burst. But this, then, has the consequence that no more stimuli can be transmitted to the heart muscle. Consequently, the heart ceases to function and thus stops beating, respectively, stops pumping blood through the veins. However, salt not only flows through the veins, but through the whole body. Without salt, the human body would be immobilized because no cell could function. Every single somatic cell is surrounded by salt water and swims about freely therein. If the salt of this liquid dwindles, then the pressure ratio alters itself in the cell so dramatically that the cell membrane disappears and the cell receives no more nutrients. Only when the salinity, respectively the concentration of salt, remains constant in the body can the heart, muscles, and nervous system of the person function smoothly. Each day, the human body loses salt, through the urine, through tears and sweat, which is why it is vital to supply the body with salt again, along with the necessary amount of liquid, but this differs depending on the person and his physical constitution, so no uniform or general measure can be mentioned. Thus, one person needs several liters of fluid per day, while another, during the same period, gets by with very little, perhaps only 1, 2, or 3 deciliters, deciliter, 1/10 of a liter. In addition to the properties of the body and all its organs and to the loss of fluid, climate conditions and physical strain and motion naturally also play an important role, as well as the drinking discipline and the mental and volitional attitude of the person. Excessive drinking is unhealthy because too much salt is removed, so new salt must be supplied to the body, which means that more liquid, respectively, water, collects in the body than what is necessary health-wise, which can cause damages through overhydration.
For my part, I drink very little, sometimes no more than 2 deciliters per day.
That is known to me. However, you will not suffer any harm from that, because you are one of those people who only need very little liquid. When it becomes necessary, you automatically drink some more because you then perceive a thirst feeling. This also applies to certain substances that your body needs, like even salt, sugar, vinegar, lemon juice, or orange juice, etc.
Yes, that is actually so. As a rule, I eat what I feel an urge to eat.
So I said. And you do well with that since you simply do not let yourself be tempted by uncontrollable cravings.
You are right, I do not. But now, a question that refers to Izmit, respectively Izmir, and to Mustafa Kemal Pasha, who later received the name Ataturk.
Yes. In 1964, you shot a revolver bullet between the eyes of his portrait when, after your serious accident at the customs station of Reyhanli and in your delirium, you demolished the main office of the police and customs station.
I first found that out and realized that 2 months later, when I returned from Kuwait and investigated all that I had done during the 29 days of my delirium. Fortunately, the customs officials had already known me very well for several years, and had also read in the newspaper about my serious accident in Iskenderun. Otherwise, they certainly would have shot me. At least that's what they said when I asked them about it, as I raged around and fired away with my revolver. Solely because they knew me well and saw that I was not in my right mind, they kept their distance, left me alone, and did not shoot me down.
I know the story very well.
Good. Then to the question. In the 20s of this century, the city of Izmir burned down completely, and the cause of the fire was never clarified up to this day. Do you know anything about this? The Greek population of the city then fled and were picked up in the ship's harbor by the garrisons of the Allied crews and was brought to Greece. The city burned for 3 days. It was the year 1920, 1921, or 1922.
That is also known to me. The purpose of the fire, which was secretly arranged by the Turkish military leaders, served to drive out the Greeks, against whom Mustafa Kemal had fought with his army and was victorious over them. Thus, the fire of Izmir served as an ethnic cleansing during the Greek-Turkish War.
And who was the evil one, or who were the evil ones? I mean, who had ordered the fire?
It was a joint decision of the executives around Mustafa Kemal Pasha. He himself had nothing to do with it.
Then now I turn to something else, namely to elephants, since I know that you are well versed in zoology and thus also in the area of wildlife. In reference to elephants, I would just like to know if I still remember Svath's instruction correctly, for I was just asked about this. Svath explained to me that elephants have an extraordinarily advanced instinct consciousness, as well as a highly advanced instinct psyche, and as a result of this, an instinct relationship also exists among their equals, and to a lesser extent, also with other life forms, including humans, if they can directly deal with elephants in a loving way. The communication of the elephants among themselves takes place in a similar wise as with dolphins and whales, etc., whereby at least these two life forms are also predisposed in a very similar wise with respect to instinct consciousness, instinct relationship, and instinct psyche. The elephants communicate among themselves using these forms mentioned, but also through touch, gestures, scents, and sniffing, as well as through audible sounds and infrasound. Is my memory right in this regard?
It is all remarkably accurate.
We have talked about asteroids and comets, and you said that several of these will appear in the coming years, or up to the beginning of the 3rd millennium, and that many new ones would be discovered. Can you tell me what will probably be the most spectacular in this connection?
It will not just be several asteroids that will be discovered up to the beginning of the 3rd millennium, but rather dozens each year. But an object that will really be something special for the Earth humans. A comet will be discovered in the month of July of the year 1995 by 2 American amateur astronomers named Alan Hale and Thomas Bopp, which is why the comet will then also be called the Hale-Bopp Comet.
And why will this comet be something special? What form will it have then? And how large and how broad, I mean, how long and how wide, will it be, and how close will it come to the Earth and to the Sun?
The length of the comet is 38,432 meters, and its width is 36,781 meters, which already explains that the object is oval-shaped. The closest point to the Earth that the comet will reach will be a distance of approximately 197 million kilometers away, and the closest point to the Sun will be approximately 136 million kilometers away. This comet will exhibit a double tail and will pull a reddish-yellow and approximately a 152 million kilometer long cloud of particles behind itself, About 2 years after its discovery, on April 1st in the year 1997, it will reach its closest distance to the Sun, under whose influence it will expel large amounts of water vapor, along with large amounts of toxic hydrogen cyanide and carbon monoxide. The actual plasma tail will exhibit a bluish, gleaming form and will be 98 million kilometers long. The age of the comet amounts to 5.24 million years. It will be discovered as a result of its great brightness, which it will already exhibit at a distance of about 1,000,000,000 kilometers away from the Sun.
Fantastic. And when will this comet come so close again that it can be seen again from the Earth?
That will take a long time, namely around 2,400 years.
And will this comet also be able to be seen from the Earth with the naked eye, like, for example, Halley's Comet?
Yes, that will be possible.
And in sectarian circles, this will probably again be an occasion to make a doomsday scenario, as this will certainly also be the case with the solar eclipse appearing in Europe on the 11th of August 1999, about which even Nostradamus has written, but which is misunderstood, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, your words will prove to be true in a sad manner because our predictions for these two events, along with others, unfortunately, testify of great disaster which will evoke delusional believers and religious sectarians. So, unfortunately, in certain sectarian communities, it will come to mass murders and mass suicides, namely in Switzerland, in France and Canada, as well as in America and in other countries. Numerous individual suicides will also have to be lamented, and indeed, especially through the fault of the so-called psychics, fortune tellers, star interpreters, and thus astrologers who make absurd prognoses and who generate just as great anxiety in their believers and in the pseudo-scientific dreamers of an esoteric, UFO-based, and parascientific character, and so on. These culpable ones will also be the ones who will coin the term Black Sun for the solar eclipse.
I already imagined something like that. But the human beings still are not more clever and are not willing to acknowledge the facts of the effective truth and to think rationally when they are told the truth. They continue to walk along in their crazy beliefs, confusing themselves more and more, just through the influence of the sectarians, star interpreters, and fortune tellers, as well as through the esoteric and pseudo-parascientists, etc. But may I ask what you meant recently when you said that in 1999, one of my friends will end his way?
It surprised me that you have not already asked about it, since otherwise you are not reserved with your questions.
It was simply because I wanted to find out for myself as to what you could have meant with your words. Nevertheless, a result remained refused to me.
Then I want to give you the necessary answer. In Jordan, you gained a friend, who was also your patron.
That was King Hussein II.
That is of correctness. My insinuation referred to him. Thus, I want to clarify and tell you that his years are numbered, for on the 7th of February 1999, he will finish his life.
He is not only a good friend of mine, but he is also a remarkable and very good man who, like me, has already survived many assassination attempts on his life. But even he will have no choice but to go his way and will have to finish this, as you said.
That will be so.
Then to something else. You once told me that the religious sectarians will increasingly take on more blatant forms and will claim many human lives. For in the name of God or Allah, etc., many murders should be committed, and many wars should be conducted. That this will come more and more is clear to me because everything in the world indeed also points to this. But now, will everything actually be laid out in such a way for sectarianism to flare up again?
Unfortunately, that will actually be the case. by what means in the future many wars, murder and mayhem, as well as suicides, and mass murders will belong to the general and global affairs of the day. Also, sectarianism will try to fight against homosexuality, in spite of all industrial and national efforts to make this acceptable in the form that homosexual and lesbian couples can form allied partnerships with each other. On the one hand, great efforts will be made in the future to recognize homosexuality as a natural form and to decriminalize this form, which is still often criminalized until now. But at the same time, everything will be ruined again by excessive sectarianism. This, especially through the religious, fundamentalist, Islamic, and Christian sectarian fanatics, who will even demand the death penalty for homosexuality and lesbianism, and who will also demand the death penalty in and of itself in some respects. And all this in the name of God, Allah, Jesus Christ, and love and justice. Concerning this, a particular Christian sect will spread itself worldwide, which has existed since 1955, tracing back to the insurance broker Arthur DeMoss, who demanded that after his death, his big-dollar fortune should be used for sectarian, respectively godly, purposes. Arthur DeMoss was an American, how could it be otherwise? And the DeMoss Foundation traces back to him, and around the turn of the millennium, this will be responsible for the fact that prominent people, such as politicians, sports heroes and actors, etc., will make use of sectarian propaganda in public media, like in television and so on, in order to find new believers for sectarianism and the Christian religion.
You have actually told me things of the future again, and this already for quite some time, even though you actually did not want to talk about it anymore.
The reason for this I already explained to you some time ago. Moreover, I confine myself mainly to things and events that will first appear at or after the turn of the millennium. But this falls outside of what we had planned.
So this means that your prophecies, which you no longer wanted to explain, only should not be given anymore for the remainder of this century?
That is of correctness. But this does not concern all things but only those things, for which there would actually be an opportunity for the Earth humans to change them, namely through better and rational actions, such that, as a result, negatives could be prevented.
So prophecies, respectively things that must be regarded as such.
That is also of correctness. We hold ourselves back from these, namely for the reason that until now we have had the experience that all the prophecies, which were expertly made, bore no fruit, and thus brought no change for the better. This is the reason why we release no more information in this regard, but only limit ourselves to predictions that, as you know, will arrive in any case, for they are unchangeable since they are based on a previewing.
I see. But you could have told me that already at the beginning, when you decided to give me information in this wise, in agreement with Ptah, if I remember correctly. Well, so, in the future, I may surely ask you for predictions that are based on a preview, and that are unalterable, if I correctly interpret your words in this form?
That also lies in the meaning of my words. You judge my explanation correctly.
And how does it stand with things of the past?
Nothing stands in the way of a response to these, when you have appropriate questions, always provided that I possess the necessary knowledge for a pertinent answer.
Then I would like to ask you this. Last year, namely on the 21st of August, 1986, over 1,700 human beings died, in addition to a lot of beasts, wild animals, and birds, when in the Central African Cameroon, a poisonous gas cloud spread itself out. Unfortunately, the media gave no further information about this, which is why one stumbles around in the dark in relation to this. Do you know something more about this?
Yes. the poisonous gas cloud escaped out of a volcanic crater lake, which is approximately 2 square kilometers in size and over 200 meters deep. And beneath this, deep inside the earth, there are still immense magma chambers of the not yet extinct volcano, but the volcano does not make a superficial appearance. On the date mentioned by you, a poisonous gas cloud explosively escaped out of the volcanic crater lake, which is named Lake Nyos. The village lying next to the lake is named Buabua, and in this, practically all life was extinguished by the poisonous gas. But that was not all, because within a radius of 25 kilometers, virtually the same thing happened, for all humans, birds, and animals were killed. Around 20,000 human beings, including many children, were seriously injured and were taken to hospitals. Lake Nyos is situated in the middle of a volcanic chain of northern Cameroon. And as explained, the volcano under the lake is not quite extinct yet, and the bubbling liquid magma is constantly releasing carbon dioxide. But this toxic gas does not escape into the atmosphere. Rather, through the high pressure of the masses of water at 200-meter depths, it combines with the waters, from which carbonic acid develops. Thus, a gigantic deposit of carbonic acid grew on the bottom of the lake for years. Then, when this had reached the critical mass, respectively size, there was a chain reaction whereby the deposit, during an explosion, shot through the water of the lake as a huge bubble of carbon dioxide and shot high into the atmosphere. On the fateful night of the 21st of August, 1986, approximately 1.7 million cubic meters of poisonous carbon dioxide gas escaped from the subsoil of Lake Nyos. And as a deadly cloud, it set itself like a carpet above the earth, within a radius of about 25 kilometers, and all life suffocated. But with this, the danger for the future was not banished because, by the turn of the millennium, an enormous deposit of carbon dioxide will once again accumulate under the lake, which will then be twice as large as the one in the explosion within the last year. If it comes to a new outbreak of poisonous gas in the new millennium, then the consequences will be even more devastating than they were a little more than half a year ago. From our side, however, we will send some more impulses in order to influence the earthly scientists to find possible means and ways, on a technological basis, to diffuse the poisonous waters at the bottom of Lake Nyos. Namely, in the form that these poisonous waters are transported above the surface of the lake in a controlled and harmless manner and are made safe.
And how does this agree with your directive, which says that you may interfere in no wise in the affairs of other peoples and civilizations?
This can be reconciled because we interfere in no affairs at all. Rather, we only send out impulses to certain scientists, who can encounter solutions with these and work on them, without them even having the slightest notion of the fact that they have received impulses from us. So they will be of the opinion that the impulses come from themselves, and they will ascribe all insights and successes to themselves. It must be said in this connection that we offer no solutions through these impulses. Rather, we only transmit impulses through which suggestions for ideas result in certain directions and so on.
You promote my understanding. But since we are already talking about volcanism, how is it actually in Italy with Mount Vesuvius? To my knowledge, this is still active, and if it comes to an eruption, it will presumably come to a worse disaster than what was the case on the 24th of August, AD 79, when Pompeii was completely destroyed by the enormous eruption of Vesuvius and was buried. The hot, liquid magma under the soil of Vesuvius is hundreds of square kilometers in size, and even extends beneath the city of Rome, as I know from you.
That is of correctness. under the volcano, at a depth of approximately 8 kilometers, there is a huge lake of magma, which has a total area of 523 square kilometers. And from this, several vents flow out of the flanks and out of the crater of the mountain, and occasional masses of magma rise just beneath the crater's surface. And if it comes to an eruption of Vesuvius, and I mean a really tremendous eruption, there will be a catastrophe of enormous proportions.
Then a question. Through the fault of the human beings, the Aral Sea is drying up, as well as the Dead Sea. Will this actually continue in such a manner? And will one have to expect that the irrationality of the human beings will actually lead to the disappearance of these two bodies of water on the map?
Unfortunately, this must be expected. If everything continues in such a manner with the abuse of the water, like through the emptying of it and through the inhibition of new inflows, then probably in no more than 100 years, neither the Aral Sea nor the Dead Sea will exist.
Recently, I was asked for the reason why the so-called Franklin expedition had failed and why all the participants had died. It was a pole expedition.
That is well known to me. Without exception, the participants of the expedition died as a result of lead poisoning, which was brought about by canned food, for the cans contained high concentrations of lead that poisoned the contents, which were then eaten by the people, by what means they fatally poisoned themselves. And those who did not die directly from lead poisoning miserably perished by freezing to death.
Then to another matter. The alleged moon landing of the Americans. Why do the alleged moon landing participants maintain, in spite of the solid evidence to the contrary, that they had actually been on the moon? One could make these ones talk by truth serums nevertheless, and could uncover the moon landing lie that fools the world.
That would hardly be possible because all the alleged participants were placed under heavy drugs and hypnosis without their knowledge, after which they were then subjected to a post-hypnotic brainwashing, and in consequence of this, all artificial memories of non-realized experiences and adventures and thus of the faked moon landing were dictated to them, which they then adopted into their waking consciousness, whereby they became believers of their alleged experiences and adventures. The drug-induced and hypnotic blockade, through which nothing should be betrayed, is so strong that it can be penetrated by no means, and such attempts could sooner have a deadly consequence than that the truth could be squeezed out.
Oh, so I see. You once said that the Incas sacrificed children in order to appease the cult gods. Where then were these children sacrificed?
At various places, but often on a high mountain, Intihuatana.
In Egypt, falcons were regarded as sacred birds and were also given as mummifications to the deceased, as additions to the graves. Where did the Egyptians get so many falcons? Did they breed or import these specifically for this purpose?
Neither, for actually, falcons were only rarely killed, mummified, and given to the deceased as additions to the graves. In truth, there prevailed in ancient Egypt an active falcon mummifying swindle, which rested on the fact that mummified forms of falcons were produced in great quantities, but these contained no falcon bones but rather animal bones, such as cow bones, etc. Many thousands of such false mummifications of falcons were produced, which were then sold at prices that were high at the time. Often involved in this commercial swindle and commercial fraud were the priests, who obtained great wealth through this.
Then a question in reference to mercury. Here it is used in ointment medicine. What other purpose does it have?
Mercury is highly antibacterial.
Then I would like to know what will be developed by the terrestrial astronomers and scientists, etc., as a further consequence of the Hubble telescope. This in reference to further surpassing this coming telescope, which should be positioned in Earth's orbit namely around the year 1990, as you once said?
First, a similar but better telescope will be built, which will be stationed on the Earth. In the new millennium, however, plans and developments will continue on, and then the so-called interferometer will be developed.
What must one understand by that?
It will be a telescope that will consist of a whole series of other telescopes that are grouped together, which will reveal undreamed of and unexpected new impressions and insights about the universe to astronomical science.
I cannot imagine that when I think of how narrow-minded these scientists are in part.
With that, you are right, unfortunately.
Sim Ya-Se once talked about Earth's petroleum reserves, just about those which were known at that time, and which should last from then until another 25 years or so. But in the meantime, several other reserves of petroleum have been found, and this still continues to occur. How will this look, however, in the new millennium?
The terrestrial oil reserves, which will become known by the turn of the millennium, should be sufficient in relation to the increasing world population and its consumption of Earth's oil, from the time mentioned until about another 70 years. But at the same time, it should be noted that this will concern only the quantities of Earth's oil reserves that are known up to then. Actually, a portion of the petroleum extracted from the Earth is constantly renewed by natural, internal processes of the Earth, as well as by natural plant deposits, animal deposits, and human deposits, due to the processes of decay and transformation with their death and decay.
That is to be well understood. But how will the further situation of the world develop with regard to the economy and unemployment? You previously talked about unemployment and the economic collapse, which will be carried well into the third millennium, whereby only after the years 2003, 2006, and in some cases even later, will improvements and, thus, positive changes occur. Does this negative prognosis still remain valid?
Unfortunately, yes, because through mismanagement in all economic sectors and industries, as well as in the governments and in all their administrations, unemployment, as new previews have proven, will be carried far into the new millennium by incompetent managers. This also applies to the indebtedness of the states, firms, and corporations, by which means many of these will change their entire structure through mergers and detrimental sales, and many will fall into bankruptcy and be dissolved. More and more, incapable, inexperienced, irresponsible, reckless, and wanton elements, which are out for their own profit, will unfortunately seize power in the firms, corporations, and governments, and these elements will be too young, too naive, and absolutely unfit to be able to fill in their positions responsibly. More and more too young and simple-minded people will be launched into high and responsible positions, to which they cannot do justice, however. Thus, positions of power will be occupied by those who do not know how to handle them responsibly, and they will abuse these positions just for their own advantage and according to their confused thoughts and ideas, namely up to treason, and they will drive everything into ruin through this. And this will be valid for the governments, as well as for the firms of the economy and for the small and large corporations. In addition, this will likewise be valid for the healthcare system, particularly for the hospitals and their doctors, but also to the independent medical and dental professions, who more and more will conduct themselves entirely for profit and will pursue mismanagement, by which means premiums for health insurance will necessarily increase to a great extent.
So you also know a lot about our health insurance system.
Of course, that is correct, for we deal with all aspects of Earth humanity.
Of course, because you must be oriented about everything. But now, I have a question regarding the entity, or the giant star, as one always wants to say, which is called Betelgeuse. If I remember correctly, Ta told me, when he showed me the entity on my great journey in 1975, that this is about 620 times the diameter of our Sun. In addition, Alnitak, also such an entity or star, should have a luminosity that is 19,000 times that of our Sun. Is this right, for I explained this to someone who asked me about it? If my information that I provided is wrong, then I would have to apologize to the man for it and rectify it.
You can rest assured because your remarks were correct in the form mentioned by you.
Then a question about the coming world events. Is there something special to say there?
Old and new rulers, as well as dangerous terrorists and entire countries, will shape the future in such a manner that it will, unfortunately, be very negative and be marked by suffering, pain, death, and destruction. Many deadly elements, such as crazy rulers and terrorists, will be able to live freely in their madness and insanity and be able to cause tremendous harm throughout the whole world. Among these, there will be many whose names will enter into the history of mankind, such as the coming President Bushes in America, Milosevic in Yugoslavia, Saddam Hussein in Iraq, Ceausescu, Osama bin Laden, Karadzic, and many others who will criminally appear in the next 15 years, but soon others will follow, who will not be one iota better. Thus, many malicious, degenerated human beings will become a talking point worldwide and will bring untold suffering throughout the world, even under the guise of peace, freedom, and the fight against terrorism and against evil in general, as this will especially be the case with the American president's Bushes, when father and son seize power at different times. All of these rulers, dictators, and terrorists will not be normal, reasonable, and responsible thinking, feeling, and acting as truly powerful people. Rather, they will be caught in their hatred as well as in their vindictiveness and lust for power. Consequently, they will only indulge in evil, destruction, and annihilation, and, thus, in terror and murder to a great extent. In their thoughts and in their feelings, they will be cold and merciless. In their lust for power, they will commit crazy and inhumane and, thus, degrading acts and will evoke power-hungry and retaliatory wars. And unfortunately, they will still be praised for this by their idiotic followers, who will be found in many governments of many countries as well as in whole populations. Consequently, they will be able to carry on their inhumane and outrageous activities against humans under their protection and applause. Especially through U.S. foreign policy, terror and war will increasingly occur to such an extent that in unreasonableness and in pathological craving for power and world domination, an American-styled, dangerous, and deadly game with fire will be operated worldwide, by what means, especially in the Islamic countries and elsewhere around the world, an enormous hatred against America will flare up more and more, which will be unspeakably rife with much suffering, pain, death, and destruction. Through the guilt and actions of the Americans, not only will entire countries be destroyed, in terms of their facilities and buildings, but also their economies, wholly apart from the countless dead ones, who will call for the U.S. military machinations and terror machinations. And just the destruction caused by explosions, bombs and missiles, etc., will be such that countless billions of sums of money will be required and necessary for the reconstruction in order to repair what was destroyed or to rebuild it. An unparalleled insanity. When one considers that billions of sums will be spent to destroy and annihilate everything in order to rebuild everything destroyed and annihilated by additional countless billions of sums. In fact, this corresponds to a crazy way of thinking, which only those who are crazy are capable of. Like already for a long time, and also in the future, the Americans constantly make wrong connections with powerful figures, terrorists, countries, and organizations in order to train these as war specialists and terror specialists, and also as Secret Service agents and spies, etc., without noticing, in their megalomania, that all these forces again and again place themselves against freedom and humanity, and in the end, also against their trainers and against the Americans as a whole. In its self-glory, the USA is not capable of grasping the damage it inflicts as a whole, not in the least to itself, and that it acts completely illogically and immoderately. Their megalomania and their selfishness, as well as their self-glory, will be more and more a farce in the coming time, namely for the whole world, which will prove itself in the coming time all over the world. What is explained, however, only represents a few facts that will influence and shape the future. And also in the new millennium, the USA will not act differently than before and, thus, will cause much disaster around the world, by what means thousands of people will die, and tremendous destruction, much suffering and pain, and great distress will come upon the world. Yet even in America itself, a tremendous amount of suffering and hardship will likewise appear, whereby also very many human beings will die as a result of the wrong American foreign policy. But the American domestic policy will also cause much harm, distress, and suffering, to which the criminal and inhumane death penalty will also contribute.
Then there are not exactly nice prospects to be expected for the future.
Unfortunately, no. But now, that should be enough questions for today. Farewell, and until we meet again.
Bye, my friend. Take care.